George Stinney Jr. is the youngest person to be sentenced to death in the 20th century. What happened to George must never be forgotten. The injustice surrounding his story reflects the harsh realities of that time. Black people rarely receive justice, but were often subjected to very severe punishment and brutality. In this video, I'm going to delve deeper into George's story because it's important that we tell his entire story. Alkaloo, South Carolina in the 1940s was a small, segregated company town. Black families lived on one side of the railroad tracks while white families lived on the other. The town's economy revolved around the Alkaloo Mill, owned by the wealthy Alderman family. This economic divide deepened social and racial segregation, making black life even harder there. Segregation and Jim Crow and injustice created the environment that set the stage for what happened to George Stinney. On March 23, 1944, Alkaloo was shaken by the discovery of 11-year-old Betty June Benniger and 8-year-old Mary Emma Thames. They were found dead in a muddy ditch with their skulls crushed. The community was in an uproar after this, and the influential Alderman family pushed for swift justice to maintain order. Suspicion quickly fell on George Stinney Jr., who was a 95-pound black boy who had been seen talking to the girls earlier that day. They had asked George where they could find some maypops, a type of wildflower. Well, when they didn't return home, a search party was organized and their bodies were found the next morning in a ditch in the color section of the small segregated community. Well, this innocent interaction between George and these two girls led to George's arrest. The very next day, the police came to George's home. His parents were not there, but his 17-year-old brother Johnny was. The police arrested both Johnny and George. They later released Johnny, but they held on to George. The police questioned George alone for hours without his present or a lawyer present. And George, being only 14, was coerced into confessing to the crime. He later recanted, but it didn't matter because the police had what they needed to move forward with George's unjust prosecution. The investigation was deeply flawed. The crime scene was mishandled, critical evidence was ignored, and police accepted George's coerced confession without even checking to see if the evidence supported it. There was absolutely no physical evidence linking George to this crime whatsoever at all, and the police never even considered that someone other than George might have committed this crime. After George was arrested, his father was fired from his job at the sawmill, and he was told to leave the county immediately. The Stinney family boarded a train and took with them only the items they can carry and never returned to South Carolina ever again. George's trial began on April 24, 1944, just a month after the incident. More than 1,000 people attended the trial. The court appointed Charles Plowden, a tax commissioner running for election, to represent George. The trial lasted for only 3 hours. George's attorney, he filed no motions. He did not challenge the admissibility of the confession. He called no witnesses, and in fact, he presented no evidence at all on George's behalf. He barely even questioned the prosecution's witnesses. The prosecution's case relied heavily on George's coerced confession and circumstantial evidence. Dr. A.Z. Bozard, the pathologist who conducted the autopsy, well, he provided vague and inconclusive testimony, and he was unable to identify the weapon or the time of death. George's attorney did not challenge his findings at all or present any expert testimony to counter the prosecution's narrative. The all-white jury deliberated for just 10 minutes before finding George guilty. The judge sentenced George to death. Witnesses in the courtroom, they said that George looked scared and actually didn't even realize what was happening or the gravity of the situation he was in. George's attorney filed no appeal on his behalf at all. The media sensationalized this case, portraying George as a monster. These false narratives fueled the bias in the courtroom, leading to a swift and unjust verdict. George's death sentence was actually not shocking considering the history of juvenile capital punishment in South Carolina. Between 1865 and 1972, all juveniles sentenced to death in South Carolina were black. The death penalty was almost exclusively reserved for black children, especially in cases involving white victims. As George's execution date approached, public appeals for clemency poured into South Carolina Governor Julian Johnson's office. Letters and telegrams and petitions from all across the country urged the governor to spare George's life. However, Governor Johnson was running for a U.S. Senate seat against a staunch segregationist named Cotton Ed Smith. He did not want to appear as to be siding with black people or being soft on race issues, so he did nothing. Johnson dismissed the appeals and emphasized the crime's brutality and deferred responsibility to the judge and the jury. He used George's execution to appeal to his electorate to enforce his commitment to white rule in South Carolina. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was led to the execution chamber at the South Carolina State Penitentiary. The electric chair was designed for adults and not children, and it was too large for George. George was so small that he had to sit on a Bible and books just to reach the execution mask. When the switch was thrown, 2,400 volts surged through George's body. The convulsions knocked down the mask and exposed George's tears. The execution was swift, and within minutes, George Stinney Jr. was dead. George's cellmate, a man named Wilford Hunter, he said that George denied having anything to do with this crime and that George couldn't understand why they would execute him for something that he had nothing to do with. George's sister, Amy, also said that George did not do this crime and that they had been with family at the time of the crime. But George's family was too terrified to speak out to the police in 1944. Decades went by, but the memory of George Stinney Jr. did not fade away completely. His case continued to resonate with those seeking justice and wanting to clear George's name. In 2006, George Frierson, a local historian and activist in Clarendon County, South Carolina, he began investigating the case. He armed himself with a large orange binder that he filled with newspaper articles and death certificates and other documents. Frierson dedicated himself to uncovering the truth and proving George innocent. His unwavering belief in George's innocence fueled his relentless pursuit, despite the personal risk and isolation he faced because of it. Frierson was not alone in his quest, though. In 2009, a local lawyer named Steve McKenzie began researching George's case. However, it was not until 2013 that Steve and a junior colleague named Matt Burgess began actively pursuing it. Burgess became convinced of a miscarriage of justice after researching George's case online. He reached out to George's surviving siblings and asked them if he could reopen the case. Initially, they said no and were hesitant, but they eventually agreed. This led to a formal request for a new trial in December of 2013. On January 21, 2014, a hearing was held to consider whether George had received a fair trial in 1944. The legal team presented compelling evidence of the numerous procedural violations that had occurred at his trial, including the coerced confession that he gave and the inadequate defense that he received, and the biased jury. Expert witnesses were called and testified about the flaws in the original police investigation and the trial, highlighting the racial biases that had influenced the outcome in George's case. Judge Carmen Mullen, who presided over the hearing, she ultimately vacated the judgment against George Stinney Jr. Her ruling cited numerous constitutional violations and really condemned the entire judicial system that failed George Stinney back in 1944. While the ruling did not declare George innocent, it was a significant step toward acknowledging the profound injustice that George suffered almost 80 years ago. What happened to George Stinney Jr. is still happening today. While they no longer send black kids to the electric chair, black kids are still being arrested at alarming rates. Black children are still victims of excessive force and false confessions and wrongful convictions. Injustice has not stopped against black children. It's just evolved. I want to know your thoughts on this. What do you think about what happened to George Stinney Jr. and what barriers are black children still facing today in our justice system? Drop me a comment down below and let me know what you think.